What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some highlights for Warhammer 40k Rogue Traders patch 1.5, which dropped just yesterday from the time of this video, and it is extensive. In fact, it is so extensive that it kind of inadvertently reminded me of something I was already going to do, which is when the rest of the DLCs drop for this next year, I have to go back and, just like I did with Wrath of the Righteous, check out my old guides and see what needs to be updated, and possibly even consider doing a full story overview like I did for, again, Wrath of the Righteous. But I mention that just to point out how extensively this patch changes stuff. I mean, we're talking nerfs to some overpowered stuff, like 45 new items, a complete rework for some of the origins, rebalancing the game's XP curve based on the DLCs that are now present, and a lot of other stuff. Now, to that end, you may well hear that and think, oh no, my build, I'm in the middle of a playthrough, and that's very fair. They have the previous patch version available via a beta over on Steam at the very least, meaning that you should be able to basically prevent this from happening by switching over to that beta branch and keeping 1.4 active until you finish your playthrough at the very least. And if you choose to continue after this patch and a save you've already got, you're probably going to have to respec your characters and rethink some of your builds due to all of these changes. Because, as I mentioned, we're talking like 45 new items, primarily Xenos and Astartes items, those origin reworks, 25 new talents, a sort of retooling of companion starting points to account for a lot of these changes, I would imagine, but also to get rid of some useless stuff they had going on, rebalancing abilities, rebalancing the colony management, changes to loot and items, and that's before we even start talking about all the bug fixes and everything that this particular patch adds and addresses, as usual, of course. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to try to cover the big stuff here, but realistically, this patch is so large that if I wanted to cover all of it, would be here for like 2 hours. Because, wow, this is a lot of stuff. But to kick it off nice and slow here, let's talk about the two biggest changes, the nerfs to Blade Dancer and Executioner. So stuff like this is always going to be a little controversial in the sense that it's a single-player game, why are you nerfing something people might enjoy, that kind of thing. And I will say that as far as the nerfs go, I do understand the why, because the two that they nerfed, Blade Dancer and Executioner, were just incredibly broken. I don't mean they were like really strong or overpowered, I mean they were broken. In particular, Executioner's Carnival of Misery prior to this, when combining it with like a Pyromancer, you could hit a couple of buttons on your first turn and literally win the fight. Regardless of like line of sight, enemy positioning, it just did not matter because Carnival of Misery hit every enemy in the battle if you set it up properly. It was absolutely busted, and I can see why they changed it. Now, there's a few changes here, but really the big one for Executioner is that change to Carnival of Misery. It is now a melee attack that does 4 times the damage of the dots currently applied to that target, which is still a really big hit, but it's single target now, which means they're probably still good for killing bosses, mind you, but they're not going to wipe the entire enemy playing field in a single hit. But I mentioned they also nerfed Blade Dancer as well. I'm a little less on board with the Blade Dancer nerfs, to be honest, because I can see why they did it, but I think they probably went a little too far, because what they've done is they've added a debuff to the Blade Dancer's main thing, Death from Above or Death Waltz, which lets them jump around the battlefield and hit enemies with AoEs and stuff, and there's a bunch of ways you can buff that and add like movement to it that makes it ridiculous. The problem here is that like every time you do that now, you get a stacking debuff until your next turn rolls around, and it is a really big debuff actually. Honestly, I think it's a little too much because it kind of discourages you from doing the main thing that you're supposed to do with that particular archetype, to the point where I would kind of have preferred they just like instituted a hard limit on that ability in terms of like numbers of times it can be used per turn, or something kind of in between. Like, I get the idea behind nerfing it, but the way they nerfed it is not something I'm a huge fan of. That's not everything they've done to those archetypes, but I would say that's the most important stuff to know. And so let's keep it rolling. So with the familiars added by the Lex Imperialis DLC, they've expanded those guys again, adding new like protocols and stuff to make them more useful in combat, but also changing up their visual appearance and giving them some abilities based on the conviction of the person who like owns the familiar, whoever that familiar is attached to class-wise. Their conviction now has an impact on the familiar, changing both its physical appearance, yes, but also adjusting like abilities and stuff, which I thought was neat. In addition to that, we see the addition of a bunch of new talents, primarily for underperforming weaponry, the things people weren't using. but also some character-specific ones, like there's one for Pascal, Irelette, and they made some changes to Marizai as well. Just a heads up, some of Marizai's interactions are still bugged as of this patch, so still some more work to do on that front, but overall getting better for him. Now, I mentioned they added a bunch of new items. A lot of this focused on adding both Xenos items, Astartes armor, and even some non-Astartes power armor for people to use. This is a big deal because it opens up more build viability for like that specific stuff. So if you want to use like Xenos or exotic weaponry, that kind of thing, they now have more items available for you to do that with. The crazy thing, though, really is the massive rebalance they did to items kind of across the board here, with literally almost every single weapon available in Act 2 seeing some sort of stat adjustment. Like, that's the level of changes we are talking about here. Probably the most interesting to me, though, just offhand, is the arc rifle changes. I've actually kind of just really liked the arc rifles, like aesthetically and the way they do their attacks and stuff, but they were a little unwieldy thanks to like their action point costs. They've changed a lot of that and kind of buffed them across the board, and so I may well actually be able to make more use of them in the future, which would be fun for me at least. But as I mentioned a little bit ago, that's actually not all the changes to things on that front either. They've also taken a look at like where you're getting these items from, like the distribution of them, which means changes to loot and vendor tables as well. Now, kind of all of that together went into changing some of the companion starting builds, the point at which you pick them up, basically, making sure that the sort of starting build that they had in mind for these characters is more useful. That's actually important even in ways you might not expect, because they also sort of standardized the way skill checks scale across difficulties throughout the game, which is important, because it makes a sort of skill monkey type character like Jay is by default that much more valuable, and I think that's a change that might go a little underappreciated in this patch, but is still nonetheless pretty interesting. Now, one thing I'm a little curious about myself with this patch, though, is the experience rebalance. So they've rebalanced experience across the board, basically making levels take longer in terms of the experience required to level up. That sounds fine, but they've done this in sort of coordination with the DLCs, and that does make me curious how that game plays for people who don't own the DLCs, which I realize might be a small number of people, but still I would hope the game is still enjoyable for them, even if they don't necessarily own the extra content. On top of that, they made some subtle tweaks to colonies. This mostly just seems to be things like the rewards and resources that you have to pour into them, that kind of thing. Some of those colony projects will now actually reward navigators' insight as well, which is useful for traversing the world map if you're unaware. That's actually a change I like quite a bit, because I think the game was a little tight with its navigators' insight, honestly. But on top of all that stuff, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. They also made a ton of changes to like narrative context, subtle tweaks to some of the DLCs in terms of like tone and delivery of voice acting to affect the narrative and like continuity of individual choices across the board, which all combines to make just a mind-bogglingly big patch. And that's without even really going into details on things like the Origin rework. So the Astra Militarum, the Commissar, the Ministorum Priest, as well as the Navy Officer all saw reworks to their abilities and stuff. One that I thought was really interesting was actually the Commissars. They now have the ability to like shoot their allies and give them a buff, which is a guaranteed critical to Xenos allies, and then if that ally dies, you buff all of the party as opposed to just them, which is a really sort of interesting mechanic. But when you look at all of this sort of in totality, I guess the thing that strikes me the most is just how, with a single patch, they've kind of rewritten the rules here in terms of like builds and meta approaches and stuff. And while some stuff is certainly still there and will work, like even just down to items, you'll probably have to do like a pass just to see if some of that stuff is even relevant to what you're trying to do anymore. But all in all, just a massive overhaul to tons of mechanics pretty much across the board. And I'm genuinely pretty excited to see people's response to this, how they wind up taking it, because I think for the most part, these are good changes. Some people will inevitably not be happy about the nerfs they've made. As mentioned, I don't really love the exact method with which they nerfed the Blade Dancer as an example. But yeah, some pretty sweeping changes here. It'll be interesting to see what people think, but for today, that's basically all I've got for you guys. I continue to look forward to the other two DLCs that are coming, And once they finish putting out those DLCs, just like with Wrath of the Righteous, again, I'll have to go through and just kind of see what still is and isn't relevant in terms of guides and stuff, and likely do a full re-review just given the scope of these changes already. But as for today, that's pretty much going to do it. So certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.